following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back. Golenbock University. I'm Ralph Tycho of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and the host of Golenbock University is with me tonight. I'm privileged. Professor Peter Golenbock. How are you, sir?
I'm just fine. Thank you, Ralph. Just fine. And you?
Good. Good. This was celebrating like 2 years of doing this, you and I, on
Very
a
nice.
fairly regular basis.
Yep.
And I just want to put the word out there that all of our offerings, not just Golenbock University, but everything Uncomfortably Zoned, is archived on YouTube. So that if you went to YouTube, put in whatever you're looking for, any of the guests we've had, any of the hosts, and just plug it in, and you will find a treasure of Peter Golenbock's talkings, views, points of views, laughter, tears. It's been wonderful, and personally, I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. I went into this thing for that word, fun. If it ain't fun, it shouldn't be getting done.
That's true.
And you've always enjoyed it, and it's a challenge for me sometimes to keep you interested, but I do it for the most part, and it's been great. So, let me ask you about the stadium, the proposed stadium, and what's going on where you live.
You're talking about St. Petersburg and Tampa,
Yes.
for the Tampa Bay Rays.
Right.
Well, they built Tropicana Field in 1986, and it was the first. They built the stadium. St. Petersburg built the stadium because every single time there's a competition between Tampa and St. Petersburg, Tampa has won. Every single time. So that the football stadium for the Bucs is in Tampa. MacDill Air Force Base is in Tampa. You know, most of the major things that are built, Amalie Arena is in Tampa. So this time around in the mid-1980s, St. Petersburg decided they were going to build this ballpark so that finally St. Petersburg would have something that Tampa didn't have. It was interesting because Steinbrenner was 100% for the new ballpark being built in Tampa, and despite that, the people in St. Petersburg decided that even though there was no prospect at the time of a team coming to St. Petersburg, that they would build it so that they would come. And they did. I think the stadium cost something like $60 million. It was bare bones, but a place where Major League Baseball could play baseball.
Right.
And after building the stadium...
Now, they built it on the come. Am I right? They built it first with the idea of attracting a team.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. There was no... nobody wanting to come there. The idea was build it, and eventually they would get an expansion team. Or what they felt was more likely, they could get one of the existing teams that was having, poor attendance, leave their town and come to Tampa Bay, which is somewhere around the 12th or 13th largest, audience in the country. And
right.
So they had an opportunity to get the Chicago White Sox, and the White Sox threatened to move to St. Petersburg, and so Chicago built them a ballpark. And they could have gotten the Minnesota Twins, and the Minnesota Twins threatened to come to St. Petersburg, and Minnesota built them a ballpark. There were a couple other teams. San Francisco was the one
if I remember.
Yeah,
correctly.
they were the one that came the closest. They really came the closest, and I think I told the story before. It had to do with Bill
White's story,
who at the time was the National League president, and he decided over his dead body would his beloved San Francisco Giants move to St. Petersburg. because when White was playing with the St. Louis Cardinals and in spring training in St. Petersburg, it was a very racist place. And so the St. Petersburg Yacht Club invited all the white players, the St. Louis white players, for breakfast, but did not invite the black players. And the beaches, it would say something like, no blacks, no dogs, no Jews allowed, that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
And
that's in our lifetime.
Yeah, it is certainly in our lifetime. And Bill White was sickened by all this, and when he saw that his Giants perhaps could come to St. Petersburg, he decided over my dead body, and he got Peter McGowan, the present owner of the Giants, to pony up the money to keep the team in San Francisco. Well, 1998, finally, after Major League Baseball had first given an expansion franchise to Miami, the Florida Marlins. They used to be the Miami Marlins when they were in the minor leagues, but now the Florida Marlins. 1998, two teams came into being, and one of those teams was the St. Petersburg Devil Rays. And the St. Petersburg Devil Rays, their owner made a contract with the city of St. Petersburg that provided that the Devil Rays would remain in St. Petersburg until the year 2027. So from 1997 to 2027, the team was to stay in St. Petersburg, and if they left, there would be a huge financial penalty if they were to leave the stadium and go somewhere else.
And that still holds, am I correct?
And that still holds. But 3 years ago, the owners of the Rays, Stu Sternberg, the new owner, he's been the owner since, say, 2006 or 7. Sternberg went to the mayor of St. Petersburg, a man by the name of Rick Kreisman, and asked to be allowed to investigate sites in Tampa. And Kreisman, who's a very smart man, gave them permission. Because Kreisman was afraid that if he didn't give them permission, because they really wanted to go to Tampa, that if he didn't give them permission, they would go to Montreal or Portland or Memphis or San Antonio or some other place. And he gave them, and it infuriated a lot of people here, that the Rays were given permission to look in Tampa. But Kreisman apparently knew something that not a lot of other people had known, which was that Tampa was not willing to give the Rays any money for a new stadium. In other words, St. Petersburg, the Pinellas County, where St. Petersburg is, has collected money through bed taxes and that sort of thing. They probably have $600,000 or $700,000, which they could contribute to a stadium in St. Petersburg. But of course, the Rays wanted to go to Tampa. So Mayor Kreisman said to the Rays, "You have 3 years. We will give you a 3-year window." This was 3 years ago, I think yesterday, something like that. "We will give you 3 years to decide where you want to move to and to design a stadium and to see if you can raise the revenue to pay for it." Well, they decided they were going to go to Ybor City, which is a very sort of, it was settled by Cubans after Castro took over. And even before that, there were Cubans in Ybor City. And they had a very nice spot there that they were going to build a new stadium. And they published the design for the stadium. And then about, 2 months ago, the people who were raising the funds to fund this thing announced that they had raised $16 million in money to pay for the stadium, which was hilarious because it had been announced that the cost of building that stadium was going to be $980 million. So they raised $16 million of the $980 million. And so at that point, I said to myself, this is a joke. This is ridiculous. And a few days ago, in fact, it was official that Hillsborough County and the city of Tampa in no way, shape, or form was going to be able to fund a new stadium for the Rays. So baseball commissioner even spoke about it, how disappointed he was that Hillsborough and Tampa had failed Sternberg in coming up with a plan to pay for this stadium. So we're now back with what are the Rays going to do now? And it seems to me that the best thing they can do, considering that Sternberg says over and over and over again that he has great loyalty to the Tampa Bay area and that he wants to stay in Tampa Bay, is that they should build a stadium in Pinellas County. About 10 years ago, they had made a proposal to buy Al Lang Stadium, which is on the water in St. Petersburg, and build a 30,000 person stadium for the Rays right there on that site. And it would have been magnificent. It just would have been fabulous. But the wealthy people who lived in the area there, along with the Republican mayor, did everything they could to scotch that idea. And so it was deader than a doornail even before it got started.
Oh.
But now we have a Democratic mayor who very much understands the value of having a major league franchise in St. Petersburg. And I have a feeling he and the Rays are going to sit down and figure out some way to put a new beautiful stadium either on that site or there's another site. We have this wonderful dog track, which is very close to Tampa. There's a Gandy Bridge that goes from St. Petersburg to Tampa, and it's on the St. Petersburg side of the Gandy Bridge. And the dog track,
have they outlawed dog racing now in
they
Florida?
have. Florida last month outlawed dog racing. So after 2020, there will be no more dog racing. So it seems to me one of the obvious sites for putting this new ballpark is in this wonderful area on the Gandy. I mean, it would be perfect. It would be absolutely perfect.
I like that. That's progressive thinking.
Sure.
As opposed,
sure.
As
sure.
opposed
and the other
to looking
reason,
to...
Yeah. And the other reason St. Petersburg wants to do this so badly is that the area where the Tropicana Field is right now would be a wonderful area to develop for businesses and hotels and new homes. And, you know, it would be a tremendous economic boost to the city of St. Petersburg. So there's a lot of motivation by the St. Petersburg and the Pinellas County people to work with the Rays to find a way to, for the most part, fund their new stadium. So I have great confidence. This is going to happen. I mean, it's now, we're in 2018, next month is 2019. I would say they've got 3 years to do this till 2022, because you then have to build a new stadium so that a new stadium is ready for the team by 2027. Otherwise, if they don't do it, I have a sneaky suspicion that baseball in Tampa Bay is going to be no longer.
Yeah. It's amazing how that mirrors the problem that the Oakland A's are having. And
I thought they solved it. I thought Oakland solved it. That they're going to have
no, they haven't. It isn't solved yet, and I don't want to get into the whole thing, but I won't feel confident that it's going to be solved until shovel meets ground.
Okay.
Because Oakland has the A's have a real hard time negotiating with the powers that be, because there's the county involved that owns half of it, and the city of Oakland. Not only that, Oakland politicians have been successful in ridding their city, if that's success, of not only the Raiders, but the Warriors. And they've made stupid decisions. They got hooked by the Raiders twice. The Raiders come back. Oakland spends a lot of money to change a beautiful stadium, a beautiful ballpark, into an all-football stadium that's horrible for baseball, and screws Oakland again by moving and not paying the bill to fix up that stadium that they moved back to from Los Angeles.
Yeah,
so,
the problem you have is that the ownership of Oakland, our boy Davis, who is not one of the finest citizens in the land.
Now it's his kid. Now it's his kid.
Yeah. Well, and
David. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you're right. Al Davis comes back, and he screwed another city. In the meantime, Irvindale gave him a whole bunch of money to put together a ballpark or a proposal. He took that and put it in his pocket, moved back to Oakland. He was not the finest of human beings on a lot of different levels, and that could bring us to a nice segue to what I wanted to talk to you about. And it's the similarities between two of the worst human beings in our history, in both sports and politics.
Yeah, they were friends.
And they were friends.
Yes.
George Steinbrenner and Donald J. Trump.
That's right.
They both
and don't forget
managed...
Rudy Giuliani, who's been involved with both of them in a big way. And that's part of the story as well.
Right, and today, as an example, when Mueller wants to talk to Trump in person again, which is his right as an investigator, Giuliani puts over my dead body this, that, and the other thing. This isn't a crime. The crime-fighting mayor of New York, he put people in jail for spitting on the sidewalk.
That's right.
Is now overlooked.
He put African Americans in jail for spitting on the sidewalk.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And possible treasonous events are not a crime. We're just it's unbelievable. So that's a good trifecta, but I was just going to start with the similarities between two men, as horrible as they are. If kudos are to be given for accumulating power, you got to give them credit. From that standpoint, I think it's their supporters that are to blame, that enabled them, that both were just they just fell into it, if you will. But Steinbrenner certainly did by inheriting his father's estate, and boy, you have stories about that. Their similarities are astounding, and you wrote the book about it. So if you would be kind enough to put into your words how they are similar and what attracts the voting populace, what attracts people to say a Trump, to support people like that, because they're deplorable by my standards. And
that's what Hillary said. That's what Hillary said. That she got in a certain amount of trouble for saying it, calling Trump's supporters the deplorables, which I thought was pretty hilarious. But start with Steinbrenner. Let's take them one at a time. Steinbrenner grew up in the Cleveland area. His father owned a shipping company. His father was a real son of a bitch. He was somebody who counted pennies when they were, people would put stamps on envelopes from the company. He would count the stamps. It was that sort of thing. Christmas, people who worked for them were not allowed off. He didn't pay them very well. He treated them terribly. He was very quick to fire people. George worked for his father in the shipping company, and there's these wonderful stories that I heard. He had gone off on one of the boats that was taking, either ore or cereal from Kellogg's, and they took him across the Great Lakes. At any rate, he was landing, and his father was standing there on the dock, and George could see the guy and could see that his father was furious. And either they were late or George had done something that had really made his father angry. And, of course, George's father had fired him for that. Another time George had done something. So George's father goes to George's desk and grabs, the center drawer of these desks with all the stuff in it and walked it over to George's house, rang the bell. George opened the door, and the father dumped the contents of that center drawer on the floor and walked away, with that sort of thing. So, if you're looking for a pat on the back from your father, George Steinbrenner was not somebody who was getting it. And in fact, he, as a 35-year-old, bought the Cleveland Pipers basketball team. He had no money at the time. He wanted his father to lend him money so that they could go to the NBA. His father wouldn't do it. He ran the Pipers for a couple of years, had very good players, had very good success, but he was the sort of guy, as the owner of the team, who would be wandering onto the field screaming at the players, screaming at the coach, screaming at the referees. A couple times he got thrown out and got technical fouls. He was the scourge, of the league. He was crazy. It was just absolutely insane. And
there was a story that you touched upon months ago that sticks in the back of my head about some forged check.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's absolutely so. I'll get to that in a minute. I'll get to the forged check in a minute, because it's a very important forged check, as I will explain to you. But at the end of 2 years, George had actually signed the Ohio State Center, fabulous center, the Ohio State Center, fabulous player, college MVP of the league. He later ended up with the Knicks. Played with Bradley, played with DeBuscher. Help me out. Very famous center from Ohio State.
It was
had a great
Jerry
memory.
Lucas.
Jerry Lucas.
Jerry Lucas.
Thank you, Jerry Lucas. He actually had signed Jerry Lucas with the notion he was going to take the Pipers and Jerry Lucas to the NBA. But at the time, the NBA needed a check for $250,000 as a down payment for going into the league. This was in the 1960s. And he wrote the check for $250,000, but of course he didn't have, the money in the bank to back it, and the check bounced. And that was really the end of both the Pipers and his chance to get into the NBA. But the amazing thing about Steinbrenner was how far he got, even though he had so little of his own money at the time to get where he wanted to get. The next thing Steinbrenner wanted to do, he wanted to buy the Cleveland Indians. He was a Clevelander, and he loved the Cleveland Indians, and he wanted to buy the Cleveland Indians. So he went to the owner of the Cleveland Indians and made him an offer. Now, this is where your forged check comes in. The son of the owner of the...
When you think of it, this is George Steinbrenner we're talking about here, folks.
This is George Steinbrenner we're talking about, yes. And the owner of the Cleveland Indians at the time was famous for TV dinners.
Swanson?
Nope, the other one. The other one.
I don't know.
At any rate, his son had been one of the people who had invested with him in the Cleveland Pipers. And apparently what George did at some point, because the Pipers were losing money, is he went to his friend's house and got one of his friend's checks and wrote this check for $25,000, which he then cashed. Fortunately, because they were friends, they didn't go to the cops and throw him in jail for doing this. But the father never forgot the fact that George had written this check that the father had to cover. And so when it came time to buy the Cleveland Indians from his friend's father, the father said, "I will sell this team to anybody but you."
Oh, wow.
So where does George go then? He goes to CBS, and he sits down with Michael Burke, who was the president of the Yankees at the time. CBS had bought the Yankees.
Now, he ran the team when you were doing Dynasty, am I correct?
Oh, Michael Burke. Michael Burke did. He was a magnificent human being and a wonderful, wonderful person. Yeah, I was doing my research. They bought the team from the Yankees 1966, 1967, something like that. And I was doing my research for Dynasty in the fall of 72, 73, right? 72, the fall of 72, because Steinbrenner and Michael Burke took over in the January of 1973. So I was there when all the CBS fellows were there, and I just had a wonderful time. They treated me, absolutely wonderfully. It was just terrific. Michael Burke could, what a mensch he was. He was just fantastic.
A down to earth guy, from what I understand.
Oh, and he was a gentleman. He loved art. He loved music. He loved the theater. He loved opera. He was one of those guys. And he signs up with this guy, Steinbrenner, who he really didn't know, not knowing that, in fact, Steinbrenner was a thug. And within, say, 6 weeks of the two of them buying the Yankees, and they bought the Yankees for $10 million, if you can believe that. The Yankees right now are worth $2 billion. George bought the team for $10 million, and I'll bet George didn't put up more than $1 million of it. But he was very clever, and he put it together in such a way that he owned, 80% of the ownership of it. And that never changed.
Right.
And so
his wife passed away this week.
Yes, Joanne.
Did you know her? Was she?
No, I did not know her, but I knew what George put her through. I knew, for instance, from what people told me, that they lived in this beautiful house in Tampa, and that one half of the house was his, and the other half of the house was hers. So living with George was not an easy thing at all. And I think it was something like, the same way Mrs. Merlin Mantle, stayed married to Mickey all those years because she wanted to be Mrs. Mantle. I have a feeling Joanne stayed married to George because it was to her benefit to stay married to George and to be Mrs.
The Bucks. Yeah. She may not have had a prenup.
I don't know. It's a little hard to explain. I really don't want to get into it. But living with George was not easy. He was a narcissist before Donald Trump made people understand what being a narcissist was all about. So what was wonderful, of course,
is that their common denominator, basically?
Oh, yeah. Oh, basically,
That
absolutely.
word.
Yeah.
That word describes
to explain what that is. What that means, basically, is that no matter who George has surrounded himself with, in other words, no matter what a great manager he may have in Billy Martin, or what a great general manager he may have in Gabe Paul or whoever, in George Steinbrenner's mind, he's still smarter than they are, and he still knows more about the game of baseball than they do, or anyone else.
Yeah.
And the other thing
There's
you
an old
learn about,
adage: if you think you're the smartest man in the world, in the room, you're not.
Well, that's true. That's true. And the other thing that I learned so much about George Steinbrenner is that really what he wanted more than anything else in the world was to have his name headlined in the newspaper every single day. So the one thing, if you lived in New York while George was the owner of the Yankees, the same way now that Trump is in the newspaper every single day, that he's the headlines on television shows every single day, the most important thing to Steinbrenner, as well as to Trump, was to be the headline in the newspaper every single day. And so he would fight with everybody. I mean, I remember doing the Bronx Zoo and hearing the stories that Sparky Lyle told me. You know, he fired some secretary because she brought him a tuna fish sandwich instead of some other sandwich that he wanted. Fired her.
George, bring me a cannoli.
Yeah, well, that's all of that. We'll get to Seinfeld in a moment. I mean, Seinfeld really, there was somebody in the Yankee organization who was feeding Larry David the truth of what was going on with the Yankees. For instance, there was one fellow who worked at the Yankees at the time, he was always the first one in the office and the last one to leave. He wanted to make sure that people knew how devoted he was to his job. And so what did Seinfeld do with that? He had George have a carpenter build a bed under his desk so that he could be the first one at the stadium and the last one at night. I mean, it was
he napped during the day.
Absolutely, utterly hilarious, because I knew I had people telling me what was going on in the Yankee offices, so I could see when Larry David was writing these stories about various and sundry things, how utterly hilarious they were, because they were based on what was really happening. For instance, George had the same thing for lunch every single day and had somebody bring it to him. And on the Seinfeld show, there was this one episode where somebody was supposed to bring him a cannoli. And for some reason one day, George wasn't going to be there, and so George was going to have the mailman, Newman, bring the cannoli to George, but then something happened to Newman, and Kramer ended up bringing the cannoli somehow, or Kramer ate it. Some utterly hilarious thing where Steinbrenner was yelling, "Where's my cannoli?" It was just, you watch these shows today and you laugh as hard now as you did when you saw it for the first time. It's just
absolutely, and the clips are on YouTube. You can get clips of stuff. Anything, but they break down.
Yeah, the thing about George is that he caused so much heartache among his employees. If you were an employee for George, the story was that you either became an alcoholic or a drug addict, or you had a nervous breakdown, or you quit in bitterness. And I find it so interesting because with Trump being the president of the United States, literally everybody who was close to him ends up either in jail or indicted or made to look like a fool or to have their reputation destroyed. I mean, it's
all of a sudden the campaign director is no more than a coffee boy. Exactly right.
With Steinbrenner, loyalty went one way. With Trump, loyalty goes one way. Because to a narcissist, the only important person in the relationship is him. And so in, say, just off the top of my head, in 20 years he would have, 14 different managers, including Billy Martin 5 times. He'd have, 12 different general managers, and he knew better than all of them. And so there was a period starting around 1980 They ended up winning the pennant in '81. But aside from that they didn't win again for, what was it, 20 years. 1999, I think, was the next. And during all of that time, George was making the deals. He was deciding who they'd get and who they'd trade. And he would get over-the-hill former All-Stars because he liked to have famous players. And they would trade away, such marvelous, marvelous young rookies that they had. And the only reason they kept Jeter and Bernie Williams and Mariano Rivera and their wonderful catcher, the only reason they kept those people was because Steinbrenner had been caught giving $50,000 to a guy who worked for Dave Winfield's organization for dirt on Dave Winfield, who was his star player. Because Winfield made the mistake of going to the newspapers and telling the newspapers what a terrible person George Steinbrenner was. And the thing was, if you went to the newspapers, that was Billy Martin's problem. Martin would go to the newspapers and talk dirt about George Steinbrenner, and he'd get fired. Joe Torre was the only manager on the Yankees smart enough to know that if he had something that he wanted to talk to Steinbrenner about, they would do it in private. So Torre managed to make it 8, 9, 10 years, however long he was the manager, because he never said anything bad about George Steinbrenner in the newspapers. A very, very smart thing. But, none of the others had quite figured that out.
Peter, did you ever consider doing a book on Torre? He's written...
Torre wrote his own book. Torre wrote a wonderful book. I was going to do a book with Lou Piniella. Piniella and I had sat down. We spent several hours. We were going to do it. And then at the last moment, he decided to do it with Billy Madden. He didn't do it with me. He did it with Billy. So, and I was unhappy about that because I really loved Piniella. I thought he was a wonderful character. We could have written a good book.
The book that I would love to read is Marvin Miller. Is a book with you and Marvin Miller. I know you. There was
Marvin and I were going to write a book as well, and that fell through because Marvin, being the negotiator he was, negotiated it down to a point where there wasn't going to be much left for me. But years later, when I wrote the book In the Country of Brooklyn, Marvin Miller was a chapter in that book, and we talked for a couple of hours, and we just had a wonderful time. Marvin Miller was a magnificent human being and the smartest
of all
person.
the people not in the Hall of Fame, it's a travesty.
Oh, please. You can't have a Hall of Fame without Marvin Miller the same way you can't have a Hall of Fame without Barry Bonds
or Gil Hodges.
Or Gil. I don't understand. That's just a whole lot. You can spend a whole hour talking about Gil Hodges and why he isn't in the Hall of Fame, for crying out loud. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. I think what happened is that people saw that so many of those Brooklyn Dodgers got in, and at some point they decided that's enough, no more. Jackie was in, and Pee Wee was in, and Duke Snyder was in, and was there anybody else? Yes, Campy, and they decided that's enough. But Gil Hodges, every absolutely belongs in the Hall of Fame.
Okay.
So, let me finish. Let me finish this one story. I got this in my head. I want to tell people exactly what happened. This was Howie Spira that George had paid $50,000 for dirt on Dave Winfield, and they caught him at it, and they suspended him for life. They suspended Steinbrenner for life. It was the second time he was suspended for life, and for a second time he was out for 2 years. And during those 2 years, Stick Michael. He's another one I really wanted to do a book with. May he rest in peace. Stick Michael was the one who kept Jeter, kept Mariano Rivera, kept Pettit, kept Bernie Williams, and kept the catcher, all on the Yankees, Posada. And by the time Steinbrenner came back after the 2 years, all 5 of those guys had made their mark with the Yankees. Mariano had been a starter when Steinbrenner was still there, and Steinbrenner hated the way he pitched and wanted to get rid of him. Meanwhile, Steinbrenner goes away for 2 years, and during that period, they made Mariano into a relief pitcher, and he became, of course, the greatest relief pitcher that ever was.
And that wasn't the first time the Yankees prospered with him being suspended.
No, that's right. That's right. The first time had to do with Watergate, with Richard Nixon, when he was giving money illegally to the Nixon re-elect campaign. And he was put out for 2 years, and during those 2 years, I mentioned his name.
His illegal contribution amounted to a felony. When I was a kid, being a felon wasn't just something, it was a felony. Wow. Big difference in our mores.
Well, he got Edward Bennett Williams to be his lawyer, and Edward Bennett Williams got letters from all sorts of judges in Cleveland and people in Cleveland. So instead of getting a jail sentence, he got a $15,000 fine. So he was he was lucky. He was lucky he didn't go to jail.
Subway tokens to the rest of us.
But Bowie Kuhn suspended him for life, which was then reduced to the 2 years that gave Gabe Paul the opportunity to build the Yankees, to trade for Greg Nettles, to trade for Chris Chambliss, to trade for Mickey Rivers, to do all the things that enabled the Yankees to win in 1976, 1977, 1978, and 1981. So the great irony, of course, is if Steinbrenner had not been out of baseball for those 4 years, it's possible during the 40-odd years that he was the owner of the Yankees, he never would have won a pennant.
Well, and just the idea that it's been 40 years,
Oh, well, that's a whole other story.
That's
I know. But if you look at
Steinbrenner, go fast or what?
Oh, please. My son just turned 31 years old yesterday. For crying out loud, he was just 5. He was just 2 years old playing baseball with the St. Pete Pelicans, where the Pelicans would be pitching to him and he would be hitting.
Oh, that must have been great for him. I didn't realize your son was that age. Wow.
He was two, and he had a bat in his hand, and he hit a wiffle ball. They pitched to him, and he hit, and he ran the bases. It was fabulous.
Great experience for him.
29 years ago.
My son just turned 28, so
wow.
I hear you.
At any rate, this was a wonderful evening.
Yes.
I'm exhausted. We'll talk
They
next
always
week.
are. Next time we'll talk a little baseball, and we'll get off the business part and the serious part of it all. But I just wanted to identify Trump or Steinbrenner as very, very Trump-like, and if I could identify Trump as being very, very Steinbrenner-like.
Sure. Understand, too, that the Yankees were able to get the new Yankee Stadium, which they did not need. They did not need a new Yankee Stadium. The old Yankee Stadium was a perfectly wonderful place to play. But the stadium cost $1 billion, and it was Rudy Giuliani who helped make it possible. The city of New York and the county of whatever and the state of New York put up a ton of money for that new stadium. And Steinbrenner took advantage of all of that. I mean, it was to his benefit. That's part of why the New York Yankees are now worth $2 billion playing in Yankee Stadium. And I used to go to the stadium when I was a kid. I'd pay $6 for the best seat in the house. And those seats today are something like, $1,500 a game.
Right. When you were a real kid, they were box seats with $350, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, you may be right. You absolutely may be right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
When you were a real kid, we're the same age.
Yep.
And the nice part, we're still kids.
Damn straight.
All right.
Damn straight. All right. Have a great week. All right. Have a happy Christmas too.
Say hi to your Wendy's.
I shall. Take care.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Golenbock University, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My God, this is fun for me. I hope it is for you listeners. Adios. The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.